For more than 40 years, the death of Natalie Wood has hovered over Hollywood like a dark cloud, long described as a tragic accident, yet surrounded by so many contradictions, questions, and haunting details that the official version has slowly crumbled in the eyes of investigators, fans, and even members of the entertainment industry who once accepted it without hesitation. And now, as new perspectives, testimonies, and forensic analyses have emerged over decades, the Natalie Wood mystery is no longer the tidy, accidental drowning story the public was fed in 1981, but an unsettling narrative filled with inconsistencies, conflicting statements, delayed emergency calls, unexplained injuries, and emotional tensions aboard the yacht Splendor. A narrative that forces us to confront the possibility that the truth may be far more disturbing than the polished accident theory that dominated headlines for so long. On the surface, the night of November 28, 1981 appeared ordinary. A holiday weekend trip to Catalina Island with Natalie Wood, her husband Robert Wagner, her co-star Christopher Walken, and the boat captain Dennis Davern enjoying dinner, drinks, and conversation. But by dawn, Natalie's lifeless body was found floating face down in the dark Pacific waters, clothed in only a nightgown and a heavy down jacket, a garment that experts later noted would have severely restricted her ability to swim, raising questions about why she would ever voluntarily put herself in a situation where falling overboard was a risk. The early explanation, that she simply got up to adjust the dinghy, slipped, and drowned, was accepted quickly by authorities, but from the moment the autopsy report was quietly filed away, the physical evidence told a story filled with red flags that have never stopped waving. Natalie was covered in fresh bruises on her arms, legs, and face, some small, some large, some clustered in places that suggested impact or restraint, not the chaotic bruising typically associated with accidental drowning. And forensic specialists who later reviewed the case pointed out that several of the marks on her forearms resembled defensive wounds, the kind a person might sustain while fending off an altercation or trying to protect themselves. One forensic pathologist who studied the case decades later said bluntly that the ocean doesn't give you bruises like that, highlighting what many investigators quietly suspected but could not officially conclude. These injuries appeared to precede her entry into the water and may have occurred during a moment of fear, struggle, or confrontation. Adding to the growing list of troubling details was the strange fact that Natalie, who had a lifelong fear of dark water so intense it was documented in interviews and confirmed by multiple friends, would have gone outside alone at night in the cold without shoes and in a thick jacket that would only make swimming more difficult, a scenario that clashed violently with everything known about her personality and history. Meanwhile, the dinghy, the small inflatable boat aboard the Splendor, was found adrift with its oars locked in place and the motor off, a condition experts claimed was inconsistent with the theory that she untied it intentionally or attempted to board it. Instead, the state of the dinghy added fuel to questions about whether it had been intentionally released after the fact to create the illusion of an accident. As investigators looked deeper, additional contradictions emerged from witness accounts, including nearby boaters who claimed they heard a woman screaming for help around the time Natalie would have gone overboard, a detail ignored in the original investigation but later resurfacing as a haunting piece of the puzzle that demanded answers. Compounding everything was the troubling delay in calling for help. According to multiple accounts, hours passed between the moment Natalie was last seen and the moment authorities were contacted, a gap of time that has been the subject of endless debate, speculation, and scrutiny, fueling concerns that the first narrative presented to police may have been shaped hastily, fearfully, or strategically rather than grounded in a clear recollection of events. The only people aboard the yacht besides Natalie were Wagner, Walken, and Captain Davern, and through the years their accounts shifted, subtly or dramatically, with Captain Davern later expressing publicly that he believed the truth was not told that night, insisting that tensions, arguments, and emotional turmoil unfolded in the hours leading up to Natalie's disappearance. Claims that investigators took seriously enough to reopen the case in 2011 and again in later years, reclassifying the cause of death from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors, a rare and significant change that suggested investigators believed the original explanation no longer matched the available evidence. Walken has remained largely silent, offering only limited comments over the years and emphasizing that he saw no violence, while Wagner, long central to public speculation, has denied wrongdoing and pushed back against theories that imply foul play, but investigators have stated repeatedly that his explanations contain inconsistencies they cannot resolve. And then there is the bruising, clusters on her wrists, forearms, knees, and face that multiple forensic experts have described as consistent with someone being held, pushed, or restrained rather than someone slipping unexpectedly into the water, bruising that paints a picture not of a peaceful fall, but of chaos, fear, or force, leaving behind a silent testimony her voice never got to give. Alone, each inconsistency might be explained away. Together, they form the chilling outline of a narrative that looks less like a tragic accident and more like a night filled with tension, alcohol, fear, and unresolved conflict, and an emotionally charged mixture that investigators, journalists, and forensic specialists have been trying to untangle for decades. The Natalie Wood case is no longer just a mystery. It is a mirror held up to the darker side of Hollywood, a place where image often eclipsed truth, where powerful figures had every incentive to protect reputations, and where a sanitized story was easier for the public to accept than a messy, painful, complicated reality. And as new generations revisit the evidence, one unsettling conclusion continues to emerge with greater force: the death of Natalie Wood may have been labeled an accident, but the story the evidence tells, layered with bruises, conflicting statements, delayed calls, and emotional turmoil, points to something far more disturbing, a truth that is no longer as hidden as it once was, and one that demands to be reconsidered with clear eyes and an open mind, because this case, after 4 decades, is not about gossip or tabloid intrigue. It is about justice, truth, and a woman whose final moments were far more haunting than the story we were told the morning she was found drifting alone in the cold Pacific waters. The deeper investigators dug into the shifting statements surrounding Natalie Wood's final night, the clearer it became that the evolving narrative offered by Robert Wagner raised far more questions than answers, and one of the most revealing observations came from an investigator who noted bluntly, "He just didn't follow her," a simple but devastating remark that underscored the widening cracks in Wagner's story, a story that changed incrementally over the years as new evidence resurfaced and public scrutiny intensified, each version acknowledging more conflict, more tension, and more uncertainty aboard the yacht Splendor than the last, yet always insisting these rising tensions had nothing to do with Natalie's disappearance into the dark waters that ultimately claimed her life. Wagner's earliest explanations centered around a calm evening, a peaceful parting, and a wife who slipped away unnoticed, but as inconsistencies began to mount and witnesses contradicted key details, his account shifted, first to mild disagreements, then to a more direct acknowledgement of an argument, and finally to a version laced with tension, but still curiously detached from the physical evidence, suggesting struggle, fear, or conflict. Even his explanation for the hours-long delay before calling for help changed over time. Originally, he claimed, he assumed she took the dinghy ashore, a scenario investigators found increasingly implausible given the rough water, the cold night, and Wood's well-known fear of dark open water. Later he claimed he was worried but unsure how to respond, an assertion that baffled maritime experts who noted that Wagner, a seasoned boater, would certainly have understood basic distress procedures and emergency protocols. And perhaps most troubling of all was the gradual shift in Wagner's description of when he last saw Natalie alive. In the earliest statements, he portrayed a quiet parting. Later, he admitted to an argument, and much later, he framed the conflict as resolved before she vanished, even as multiple witnesses on nearby boats reported hearing the sounds of a loud, heated argument continuing on the yacht long after Wagner claimed peace had been restored. Investigators recognized these incremental shifts as classic distancing behavior, each revised version acknowledging just enough new detail to align with emerging evidence while simultaneously attempting to separate the speaker from any implication of involvement, a pattern that raised enormous red flags among experienced detectives. By 2011, as forensic specialists re-examined bruising patterns, as witness testimonies resurfaced, and as Captain Dennis Davern publicly contradicted earlier narratives, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department made the significant decision to name Wagner a person of interest, a designation that fell short of calling him a suspect, but signaled clearly that investigators believed he held crucial information about the night Natalie died, information that could help resolve the long-standing discrepancies. Yet in the face of this renewed inquiry, Wagner made a stunning shift, from initially cooperating with investigators to refusing all contact and declining to answer further questions, a silence that investigators described as deeply concerning, particularly from someone who had always maintained a desire to find the truth about his wife's death. And while Wagner's changing accounts cast a long shadow over the case, the presence of Christopher Walken, the third adult aboard the yacht, introduced another layer of complexity. Walken, one of Hollywood's most distinctive actors and Natalie's co-star in the film Brainstorm, offered a statement so minimal, so reserved, and so carefully worded that investigators described it as rehearsed to the point of sterility. A statement that revealed nothing of the emotional temperature aboard the yacht, nothing of the reported argument, and nothing that might illuminate the unexplained injuries on Wood's body. He claimed he went to bed early, heard nothing, saw nothing, and knew nothing, a response that left investigators baffled because, on a 60-foot yacht, during a night marked by alcohol consumption, raised voices, and conflicting accounts of movement aboard the vessel, it seemed improbable that someone so physically close to the events could have been so entirely unaware of the chaos unfolding around him. Over the decades that followed, Walken maintained an almost impenetrable silence, refusing interviews about the case, declining to participate in documentaries, offering no elaboration in public forums, and avoiding further discussion with investigators when the case was reopened, a silence that one investigator summarized starkly: 3 people went on that boat. Only 2 came back with a story. With Wagner offering accounts that shifted like sand beneath the pressure of scrutiny, and Walken offering almost nothing at all, the burden of narrative fell largely on Captain Davern, whose detailed recollections of shouting, tension, and delayed emergency calls contradicted the early official narrative and helped reignite public interest in what many came to see as one of Hollywood's most troubling and unresolved tragedies. Walken's silence sparked countless theories, some suggesting he feared damaging his career, others suggesting he wanted to avoid implicating anyone, and still others believing that whatever Walken saw or heard that night was too disturbing, too precarious, or too painful to revisit publicly. And through all these layers of shifting statements, withheld testimony, and long-standing emotional wounds, the heart of the mystery remains: the bruises on Natalie's body that forensic experts described as inconsistent with an accidental fall, the contradictions in the accounts of those aboard the yacht, the unanswered screams reported by nearby boaters, the hours before help was called, the heavy jacket she wore despite her lifelong fear of dark water, and the silence deafening, enduring, and unresolved, from the two men who were closest to her that night. Together, these elements form a chilling puzzle whose pieces have never fully aligned, a haunting tableau of shifting narratives and unspoken truths that continue to shadow one of Hollywood's most tragic and perplexing deaths, reminding us that sometimes the most enduring mysteries are not the ones we cannot solve, but the ones that certain people refuse to help resolve. One perspective proposed by analysts close to the case suggests that Christopher Walken's decades-long silence may have been shaped from the very first hours after Natalie Wood's death, when he reportedly retained criminal defense counsel almost immediately, an extraordinary step for someone who, according to the early official narrative, had witnessed nothing suspicious and possessed no information that could incriminate himself or anyone else. Yet the existence of that legal preparation opened the door to a wave of speculation about whether Walken was advised explicitly to remain silent to avoid entangling himself in what might eventually become a criminal investigation, a theory that gained further traction in 2011 when reopened case documents revealed just how swiftly he had taken steps to protect himself legally. Alongside this legal caution theory is another, darker interpretation suggesting that Walken's silence may also reflect long-standing fear of Robert Wagner, a powerful Hollywood figure whom Walken was said to have witnessed in a state of volatile anger that night. Anger fueled, according to Captain Dennis Davern, by Wagner's jealousy over what he perceived as an inappropriate closeness between Walken and Wood during the filming of Brainstorm, a jealousy that allegedly erupted into accusations, smashed glass, and escalating rage aboard the yacht, leaving open the unsettling possibility that Walken's silence stems from concern, even decades later, that speaking candidly about what he witnessed might trigger some form of retaliation. Yet another interpretation, perhaps the most sympathetic, suggests that Walken's silence is not rooted in fear or legal caution at all, but in loyalty to Natalie Wood's memory and respect for her daughters, Natasha and Courtney, with some believing that Walken, who reportedly witnessed at least part of the heated argument between Wood and Wagner, may be withholding details that could cause emotional devastation to Wood's surviving family, choosing instead to carry the burden privately rather than reopen wounds for those who already lost far too much. What makes Walken's silence so consequential is the widely supported belief that he was the last person besides Wagner to see Wood alive, placing him at the heart of the timeline during the critical moments when Wood's life transitioned from argument to disappearance. According to multiple reconstructions of that evening, Walken was present during the early stages of the explosive confrontation that shifted from the salon to the deck, and his recollection of the tone, volume, and emotional temperature of that argument could potentially illuminate the unanswered questions that have haunted the case for more than 40 years. When the case was officially reopened in 2011 by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, Walken did eventually meet with investigators, but reports indicate that his cooperation, though technically fulfilled, was minimal, with law enforcement sources describing his responses as limited and lacking crucial detail, leaving many of the most important timeline gaps untouched and reinforcing the dissonance between Walken's thriving Hollywood career, over 100 films since 1981, and his unwavering refusal to speak publicly about the most infamous night of his life. Whether motivated by legal caution, fear, respect for the dead, or an internal conflict too painful to revisit, Walken's silence has allowed the dominant narrative of that night, shaped heavily by Wagner's changing accounts, to remain largely unchallenged, a silence that investigators say has effectively made him a passive guardian of whatever truth unfolded aboard that yacht. But the silence surrounding the case cracked in 2011 when Captain Dennis Davern, after nearly 30 years of publicly supporting Wagner's version of events, abruptly broke ranks and accused Wagner of lying to authorities and of being directly responsible for the sequence of events that led to Wood's death. Davern's reversal, first revealed in his 2009 book Goodbye Natalie, goodbye splendor, and expanded upon in televised interviews and official statements, shattered the long-maintained facade of a tragic accident, instead exposing what he described as a night of escalating rage, jealousy, fear, and concealment aboard the Splendor. Davern claimed that Wagner was not merely annoyed by the perceived closeness between Walken and Wood, but consumed by jealousy to the point of smashing a wine bottle and accusing Walken of wanting to sleep with his wife, an incident Davern described as so volatile that Walken retreated to his cabin, while Wood, frightened and emotionally overwhelmed, attempted to remove herself from the confrontation. According to Davern, the argument between Wagner and Wood did not end as Wagner later suggested. Instead, it intensified, growing louder and more aggressive as it moved from inside the yacht to the back deck, and Davern said he heard the couple engaged in a heated verbal exchange so intense that it left him fearing that the situation might spiral into violence. Davern's new account further alleged that after the argument reached its peak, the yacht fell into an unnatural silence, after which he claimed Wagner prevented him from turning on the searchlights, refused to call for help immediately, and insisted that Wood must have taken the dinghy, an explanation that Davern said he knew instantly was false, given Wood's well-known fear of dark water and her unwillingness to take the dinghy alone at night. This delay in contacting authorities, hours during which Wood was missing but no search was initiated, became one of the most damning elements of Davern's revised testimony, directly contradicting Wagner's earlier justifications and raising troubling questions about why critical time was lost when Wood might still have been alive. The combination of Davern's new statements, Walken's continued refusal to give detailed testimony, and the forensic reevaluation of Wood's injuries triggered a seismic shift in the case, transforming it from a long-accepted accident into an unresolved mystery now clouded by conflicting accounts, contradictory timelines, bruises inconsistent with accidental drowning, and two men, one silent, one evasive, whose testimonies have never aligned with the mounting physical and circumstantial evidence. And as investigators continue to revisit the case in search of clarity, one haunting truth remains: the final hours of Natalie Wood's life were witnessed by three men, yet more than 40 years later, the world still does not have a coherent account of what truly happened aboard the yacht Splendor, and may never have it unless the silence breaks. The most explosive and unsettling part of Dennis Davern's revised testimony emerged when he described what happened after the argument between Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner moved from the yacht's salon to the back deck, a moment he said he recognized immediately as different from every previous dispute he had witnessed between them. According to Davern, the escalating shouting suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie and unnatural silence that made the hair rise on the back of his neck, and when he stepped outside to see what had happened, he found Wagner alone on the deck, tense, agitated, and allegedly claiming that Natalie had vanished into the darkness. Davern said that he immediately urged Wagner to call for help, to turn on the searchlights, to alert the Coast Guard, or at the very least to initiate some kind of emergency response, but instead of showing alarm or urgency, Wagner allegedly ordered him not to take any action, telling him they should wait and see if she returns, a command that Davern would later describe as the moment he realized something was profoundly wrong, because Natalie Wood, who was terrified of dark water and would never take a dinghy alone at night, was not someone who simply wandered off for a stroll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. According to Davern, what followed during the next several hours was not a frantic search for a missing wife, but a chilling period of delay and deflection in which Wagner appeared more concerned with controlling the narrative than with finding Wood. Davern claimed Wagner made phone calls to the mainland, poured himself more drinks, and issued explicit instructions to Davern to get your story straight before authorities arrived, behavior that suggested not panic but preparation, not confusion but strategy. This alleged 4-hour delay between when Wagner discovered Wood was missing and when help was finally summoned became one of the most damning components of Davern's revised testimony. Because if Wood had survived initially, if she had been conscious in the water, if she had been clinging to debris or fighting to stay afloat, those lost hours could have meant the difference between life and death. Investigators later noted that this delay aligned disturbingly well with multiple pieces of previously unexplained evidence. Wood's defensive bruises, the grab mark patterns on her forearms and wrists, the abrasions inconsistent with a simple fall, and the absence of any signs that she willingly boarded the dinghy. While skeptics questioned Davern's credibility, accusing him of sensationalizing events for profit, pointing to the release of his book, or suggesting that perhaps he harbored resentment toward Wagner, Davern insisted he had originally stayed silent out of fear, loyalty, and emotional paralysis, saying Wagner's influence had intimidated him into complying with the accident narrative for decades before guilt finally compelled him to reveal what he believed was the truth. Crucially, many of Davern's revised claims were corroborated by independent sources and physical evidence that had not been publicly known when he came forward, such as the forensic interpretation of Wood's bruises by modern experts, and reports from witnesses on nearby boats who said they heard prolonged shouting, including what sounded like a woman crying for help around the time Wood disappeared. These corroborations lent Davern's story a legitimacy that could not be dismissed as mere opportunism, and within months of his public disclosure, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department made the extraordinary decision to reopen the investigation into Wood's death in November 2011, something virtually unheard of for a case long ruled an accidental drowning. When investigators began re-examining the autopsy with modern forensic techniques, they found that Wood's injuries, the clusters of deep, fresh bruises on her arms and legs, the linear marks consistent with someone gripping her wrists, the abrasion on her cheek, were not consistent with a simple slip into the water, but appeared far more consistent with a physical altercation occurring shortly before her death. This reanalysis cast serious doubt on the initial 1981 conclusions and raised haunting questions about how such significant evidence of trauma had not prompted deeper scrutiny the first time around. Investigators also reviewed witness statements from boaters who had never been contacted during the original investigation, some of whom insisted they heard a loud, heated argument continuing on the Splendor long after Wagner claimed everyone had gone to bed. They also discovered inconsistencies in Wagner's evolving statements over the years, shifts in timeline, changes in tone, new admissions of conflict, all of which suggested a pattern of incremental disclosure rather than a clear, consistent memory of events. As detectives pieced together these elements, the case transformed from a forgotten Hollywood tragedy into a potential homicide shrouded in misdirection, fear, and decades of silence. The reopened investigation revealed a troubling picture, a night fueled by alcohol, jealousy, volatile emotions, conflicting testimonies, physical evidence inconsistent with an accident, a delayed search effort, and two surviving witnesses, Walken and Wagner, whose stories either changed or vanished into silence. With every new review, the so-called accident explanation unraveled further, replaced by a darker, more plausible reality that Natalie Wood did not simply fall overboard by mistake, but died on a night marked by confrontation, confusion, and choices that may have prevented her from ever being rescued. And with the case now reframed, not as a tragic mishap, but as a potential criminal event, investigators made one stunning declaration. Robert Wagner, once the grieving husband, was now officially named a person of interest, signaling that the search for truth was far from over and that Natalie Wood's long-buried secrets were finally forcing their way back toward the light. Modern forensic analysis would ultimately shatter the long-standing myth that Natalie Wood simply slipped into the ocean by accident, revealing instead a chilling pattern of injuries that made such an explanation impossible. and forcing investigators and the public alike to confront the disturbing possibility that her final moments were not shaped by misfortune, but by violence. Experts who re-examined Wood's autopsy decades later determined that many of the deep bruises on her arms, wrists, and face were starkly inconsistent with the theory that she had fallen while attempting to secure the yacht or dinghy, and instead pointed toward physical force, restraint, and defensive struggle. These bruises, clustered, patterned, and located in areas typically associated with being grabbed, pushed, or struck, told a story that the original investigation had failed to recognize. Bruises on Wood's wrists resembled the marks left when someone grips another person tightly. Bruises on her inner arms reflected the force of being pulled or restrained, and marks on her face suggested impact with a hard object or surface, not contact with water. Particularly significant was the medical examiner's conclusion that these injuries occurred before she entered the water, a finding that directly contradicted the long-accepted claim that she slipped accidentally and drowned. These revelations, combined with an understanding of Wood's lifelong fear of water, a phobia so severe that she avoided dark open water whenever possible, made Wagner's claim that he assumed she had voluntarily left the yacht in a dinghy in the middle of a cold, windy November night not just implausible but absurd. As a result of these modern forensic reassessments, in January 2013, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office took the extraordinary step of changing Wood's official cause of death from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors, formally acknowledging that the evidence contradicted the simple accident narrative that had been accepted for more than 30 years and opening the door to the possibility of criminality. This shift in the official record cast a harsh light on how the original investigation had been handled. Witnesses on nearby boats who insisted they heard a woman's desperate cries for help around midnight, a woman screaming, "Help me! Someone, please help me!" had never been properly interviewed. In 1981, the yacht's dinghy, which was later found beached with its oars neatly stowed, showed no signs of being used in a panic, further undermining the idea that Wood attempted to leave voluntarily, and, most disturbingly, Wood's body had been released for burial before all forensic testing had been completed, which meant that crucial evidence that might have clarified her final moments was lost forever. The reopened investigation in 2011 also uncovered troubling discrepancies in the statements given by Robert Wagner, who had offered different timelines, different emotional tones, and different descriptions of the night, depending on the year and the interviewer. His evolving versions of events reflected not clarity but careful revision, each subsequent account acknowledging more tension and more conflict than the one before it, while still insisting that none of it had anything to do with Wood's disappearance. These shifting explanations, combined with Wagner's refusal to speak with investigators once the case was reopened, ultimately led the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to name him a person of interest in February 2018, a dramatic and virtually unprecedented move for a case considered closed for decades. Investigators stated bluntly that Wagner's statements were not credible, that the physical evidence contradicted his accounts, and that his refusal to cooperate only deepened suspicion. Meanwhile, new witnesses emerged, people who had been anchored in Isthmus Cove that night and had heard a woman calling for help repeatedly before her voice suddenly stopped. These testimonies aligned perfectly with the time frame of Wood's disappearance and directly contradicted the claim that she slipped silently into the sea. The harbor master who recovered Wood's body also revised his original statements, describing her broken fingernails and the condition of her hands as evidence that she had fought desperately to climb onto something, perhaps the dinghy, perhaps the hull of the yacht, before the freezing water and exhaustion overtook her. Amid these disturbing revelations, one voice remained unwavering and relentless for decades: Natalie's younger sister, Lana Wood, who has fought tirelessly to challenge the accident narrative and bring attention to the contradictions, the bruises, the delays, and the unanswered questions. From the very beginning, Lana insisted that her sister's death was not an accident and that the truth had been buried beneath influence, fear, and Hollywood power. She has appeared in interviews, written books, confronted investigators, and pressured public officials, driven by love, grief, and a bone-deep conviction that justice was never served. Her persistence helped keep the case alive when the world moved on, and her decades-long advocacy played a crucial role in pushing investigators to reopen the case and re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes. Today, thanks to her determination, the world views Natalie Wood's death not as a tragic mishap, but as a haunting, unresolved mystery whose true story remains buried beneath lies, silence, and 4 decades of conflicting testimonies, yet a mystery inching closer and closer to the truth. Unlike investigators restricted by legal frameworks or journalists confined by editorial limitations, Lana Wood has spent the last 40 years navigating those boundaries with a blend of personal anguish and unrelenting determination, becoming the one figure uniquely positioned to speak with both the emotional conviction of a grieving sister and the informed clarity of someone who knew Natalie better than anyone. She has never wavered, never softened, and never once adjusted her core belief that her sister did not slip into the dark water by mistake. Instead, she has insisted again and again that Natalie Wood's death was not an accident, but the result of human actions that were concealed, manipulated, and defended by people with power, influence, and something to lose. "My sister didn't drown, she was killed," Lana has stated with heartbreaking finality, most recently in her searing 2021 memoir, Little Sister, a declaration rooted not in fantasy, but in her intimate knowledge of Natalie's lifelong terror of deep water, her emotional turmoil during the final weeks of her life, and the perplexing contradictions embedded in every version of Robert Wagner's retelling of that night. Lana has repeatedly emphasized that Natalie would never, under any circumstances, have climbed into a dinghy alone at night. Her phobia, born from a traumatic childhood near drowning on the set of The Green Promise, was so severe that she often avoided. She hated the dark ocean with a visceral fear that shaped her private life, her travel decisions, and her behavior around boats. Yet the official narrative asked the world to believe she voluntarily stepped into a dinghy soaked in darkness and cold waves at midnight, a scenario Lana insists is not just unlikely but impossible. Beyond Natalie's fear of water, Lana has also spoken about the painful emotional landscape of Natalie's marriage to Robert Wagner, a relationship she describes as marked by controlling behavior, intense jealousy, and a growing tension that Natalie confided to her sister during the weeks before the fateful Catalina trip. According to Lana, Natalie privately admitted she was considering ending the marriage again, a revelation that casts the heated argument aboard the Splendor in an even more troubling light. One family friend even recalled Lana pleading with her sister, "Don't go," a chilling detail that, while unverifiable, reflects Lana's long-standing sense of dread about that weekend. Over the decades, Lana's relentless advocacy, her interviews, articles, confrontations with Wagner, collaborations with investigators, and unwavering willingness to speak painful truths, has been dismissed by some as a grieving sister's inability to accept tragedy. Yet her claims have increasingly aligned with modern forensic analysis, new witness testimony, and the revised conclusions of official investigators. The bruises on Natalie's body, once brushed aside as incidental, are now understood as signs of physical struggle. The unexplained 4-hour delay before calling for help, once accepted without question, now appears damning. And Wagner's inconsistent stories, once seen as the grief-stricken confusion of a devastated husband, now read like calculated revisions as evidence emerged that contradicted earlier versions. Lana's insistence that Natalie feared Wagner's temper and jealousy has been echoed by friends, agents, and confidants who recall Natalie sounding increasingly fearful and emotionally exhausted in the weeks before her death. Coupled with Dennis Davern's explosive testimony, about Wagner's rage that night, her warning gains heartbreaking weight. Lana's belief that Natalie was preparing to leave Wagner has been further supported by statements from Wood's inner circle, people who recall conversations about major life changes following the completion of Brainstorm. Critics who accuse Lana of seeking publicity ignore the fact that she maintained this crusade quietly for decades when no cameras were pointed at her and no books were being released. A crusade driven not by opportunity but by grief that never found closure. As all 6 pillars of the case are examined together, the forensic contradictions, Wagner's shifting accounts, Walken's eerie silence, Davern's damning reversal, the 2011 reopening of the investigation, and Lana's unwavering testimony, a chilling and coherent picture emerges, one that points not toward a tragic accident, but toward a confrontation that spiraled out of control. A fall or push that placed Natalie into the water unconscious or incapacitated, and a catastrophic decision to delay calling for help. Investigators now believe the most likely scenario involves a violent argument between Wood and Wagner that escalated physically, a moment in which Natalie either fell or was pushed into the water, followed by a devastating lack of immediate assistance that ensured her death. The tragedy does not end with the event itself. It extends through the decades-long protection of a false narrative, bolstered by Hollywood influence, institutional deference, and an inadequate original investigation that left crucial witnesses unexamined and critical evidence unexplored. What makes this case haunting is not simply the likelihood that Natalie Wood's death was no accident, but the disturbing probability that the truth was suppressed to protect reputations and careers, leaving a family without answers and a legacy overshadowed by unanswered questions. Today, as investigators, forensic experts, and witnesses converge on a version of events far removed from the original official story, the evidence increasingly suggests that what happened aboard the Splendor that night was the result of human actions, anger, fear, violence, silence, not a tragic misstep in the darkness. While legal justice may remain out of reach after 40 years, the historical record is finally bending toward the truth. Natalie Wood did not simply drown, she died under circumstances that were concealed, manipulated, and defended for nearly half a century, and the world can no longer accept the accident narrative that once provided emotional comfort at the cost of truth.